Okay, welcome everyone to this first CSSR webinar of the fall 2023 term. A bit of a late start, but a pretty great one because we have Aaron Ross here today presenting his new book here. I've got it here, The Holy Spirit and the Eagle Feather, The Struggle for Indigenous Pentecostalism in Canada. My name's Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme. I'm your host for today from the University of Waterloo. I'm based here in the region of Waterloo, and my university, as well as Wilfrid Laurier University, are situated on the Haldimand Tract. So that's land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And so welcome to you all. We'll hopefully have a really exciting webinar for us today. Aaron's going to present for about half an hour on his book, and then we'll have about half an hour for Q&A. And just before Aaron starts, I want to introduce you all to him to present his bio. So Aaron Ross holds a BA Honours specialization in history, a major in French from the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, a Master's of Divinity with a major in Pastoral Ministry and minor in Pentecostal Studies from Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, and a PhD in Theology with a concentration in the history of Christianity from the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. So Aaron is a settler Canadian history of Christianity. In the book, I believe, Aaron, you self-describe yourself as an ally to Indigenous communities. You're also an ordained minister with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, a lead pastor of Richmond Pentecostal Church, and an instructor in the history of Christianity at Summit Pacific College in British Columbia, and joining us today from Vancouver. Okay, so thanks for being here, Aaron. I'm just going to turn off the screen share here, and I give you the floor. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's my great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for joining me. Thank you for that warm welcome. As I introduce this book, and this is again a great honor to be invited to do this. First of all, want to acknowledge that I live in the city of Richmond, British Columbia, where I live, work, and play and gather. And Richmond is situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Tsawwassen, Kwantlen, Musqueam, and other Coast Salish nations. As Sarah pointed out, on the subject of authorial positionality, just like to identify that I am a settler Canadian. My ancestry is predominantly Euro-Canadian. I studied French, but I am an Anglophone. And I furthermore identify as a Christian, and related to that, as well as of particular significance to this book, I am a practicing minister holding ordination with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. On the 12th of July, 2000, Matthew Kuhncombe, EU from Mistassini, Quebec, former Grand Chief of the Northern Quebec Cree, was elected to the position of National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, or AFN, the highest of office among First Nations. That Midsummer Ottawa Day, Kuhncombe delivered his acceptance speech. The dynamic and celebrated First Nations leader and now newly minted National Chief doubled down on his confrontational campaign promises, vowing to take Ottawa to task over Indigenous treaty rights. Kuhncombe declared, quote, "I want Canada to respect the treaties it has signed with us, for they are also the rule of law," and emphasized that he, quote, "strongly believed in the freedom of religion for all people." The day prior, Kuhncombe drew thunderous applause from his fellow AFN delegates for stating, "I want to be National Chief, but one that lobbies and opens doors and facilitates. I don't want to be a National Chief that competes with our chiefs and councils for programs and funding dollars." At Kuhncombe's inauguration, former National Chief Ovid Mercredi, Nehina from Grand Rapids, Manitoba, passionately proclaimed to the roomful of chiefs that it was, quote, Kuhncombe's destiny to succeed as National Chief, and that it was important to the future of Canada's native bands that he be allowed to fulfill that destiny. When Mercredi finished speaking, a procession of chiefs formed from the back of the room, and one by one they publicly confirmed their support for Kuhncombe. Armin Mackenzie, Innu from Northern Quebec, recalled, quote, "It was a powerful moment. The chiefs were moved." Kuhncombe's election was significant, not least because he was the first Eastern chief named to the top post of the largest Indigenous organization in Canada, but also because of Kuhncombe's religious affiliation. It was well known that Kuhncombe was Pentecostal, had attended Bible college, and was a member of a prominent Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, or PAOC, congregation in Ottawa. In fact, Kuhncombe was the first Pentecostal to hold the National Chief position. Kuncum recalled of the event, quote, "I was prepared to lose this election, but I am not prepared to abandon the gospel of Jesus Christ." The overtness of Kuncum's Pentecostal association was lost on neither his fellow chiefs nor the international media, with the New York Times reporting that Kuncum's, quote, "strong conviction stems in part from his beliefs as an evangelical Christian." The national chief's inauguration serves as an historically culminating moment, illustrating the rise to prominence of Indigenous Pentecostal affiliation and influence. Canadian historian of Christianity Robert K. Birkinshaw wrote, "The election of Matthew Kuncum raised questions about religious faith among Indigenous people. The election of a Pentecostal to the highest office among Canada's First Nations unexpectedly brought attention to the quiet but extensive growth of Pentecostalism among the Native peoples of Canada." While historically many denominations and faith groups missionized Indigenous peoples, by the 21st century, the most rapidly growing religious group among them was not Catholic, Anglican, Baptist, United Church of Canada, nor Christian Missionary Alliance. It was Pentecostal, rivaled only by the rapid resurgence of Indigenous traditional spiritualities. Pentecostalism, increasingly led by local individuals and frequently a focal point of community life, had become a prominent religious force in many Indigenous communities. In addition to being rapid, the growth of Pentecostalism among Indigenous peoples has also been recent. According to Canadian census data, in 1971, just less than 7,000 Indigenous people identified as Pentecostal. By 1981, that number was close to 14,000. In 2001, 19,000, quote, registered Treaty Indians identified as Pentecostal. And this figure accounts for 3.4% of registered Treaty Indians. By 2011, that figure had increased to nearly 37,000 respondents who identified as both Aboriginal and Pentecostal, accounting for 7.6% of respondents identifying as Aboriginal. An additional 35,000 Canadians with some Indigenous ancestry claimed to be Pentecostal. The rate of subscription to Pentecostalism among registered Treaty Indians is almost 3 times that of Canada's overall population, the latter being 1.2%. In particular, the 1981 to 2001 period of increase in Indigenous Pentecostal adherents compares favorably to the rate of practice of Pentecostalism among the general population, which plateaued during the same time frame. By comparison, roughly 1 in 10 Pentecostals in Canada are Indigenous. And approaching the dawn of the third millennium, the rate of growth of Pentecostalism among Indigenous peoples had outpaced the rate of growth of the Indigenous population overall. Indeed, Indigenous Pentecostals form a substantial group numerically, but also symbolically, as they occupy increasingly significant socio-political position and status, with many filling leadership roles. Some have been band and council chiefs, such as Billy Diamond, EU from Wasaganish, Quebec, and the first Grand Chief of the Grand Council of the Crees, as well Reggie Neposh, EU, and former Chief of Ujbugamu First Nation, Quebec, and of course Matthew Kuncum, who ascended to the AFN's national leadership. Given the prevalence of Indigenous Pentecostalism, it is important to explain the rationale for looking specifically at the PAOC. The PAOC is the largest Pentecostal organization in Canada. Of Pentecostal and evangelical organizations in Canada, the PAOC maintains the highest level and rate of Indigenous adherents. Further, the PAOC has a well-articulated and well-documented Pentecostal missiology, missiology being the philosophy of Christian mission, that is accessible for research purposes. That missiology is characterized by a concept termed the Indigenous principle. This principle is a strategy whereby the first wave of Indigenous adherents to Christianity were to be trained to replace the missionaries in the ongoing task of ministry and local church leadership. And as a strategy, the Indigenous principle wasn't new, having been employed by the PAOC preceding Anglican, Catholic, and United churches, and of the United Church's antecedent denominations. And those 3 groups together, Anglican, Catholic, and United Church, throughout the book, I refer to them cumulatively as the longer established churches. But now the task for the PAOC would be to make good on what the longer established denominational predecessors had already attempted for generations. This was a challenge PAOC missionaries were willing to accept, confident their message was unique among denominations. PAOC missionaries believed they practiced the indigenous principle, and as such, they confidently claimed that they were proponents of Indigenous autonomy, thereby resisting charges that their activity was a force for assimilation. And along those lines, in what little scholarly attention has been given to the history of Euro-Canadian Pentecostal and Indigenous encounter in Canada, historians generally have declined to accuse Pentecostals of attempting to assimilate Indigenous participants. Nevertheless, a thorough examination of source materials reveals that Pentecostal missionaries at first claimed the goal of training Indigenous people, and in some quarters involved them in ministry leadership more than the longer established churches did. Still, my book challenges the assumption that Pentecostal missionaries universally allowed more autonomy to Indigenous adherents than did the longer established churches. Generally, in its mission to Indigenous peoples, the PAOC's predominantly Euro-Canadian leadership claimed to support the Indigenous principle, yet subtly undermined it, doubting and ignoring Indigenous ministers, and opposing the integration of Indigenous culture within Pentecostalism. Now, I should qualify that when speaking about Pentecostalism, it's important to define what we're talking about. And in my book, I lean towards the term classical Pentecostalism. Just briefly, I'll give some background to Pentecostalism. Pentecostalism traces its roots, as a movement, it traces its roots to the Bible, particularly the New Testament books of Acts and Corinthians. But its early 20th century emergence has diverse origins. From various theological currents and from various regions of the world. The classical Pentecostal historiography tends to focus on those currents within North America. Influences like Methodism and holiness movements contributed to the spiritual fervor of the late 19th century. And while there were key revivals occurring in Wales and India, it was at Charles Parham's Holiness Bible College in Topeka, Kansas, around 1900 that many historians of classical Pentecostalism define as a defining moment. The Azusa Street Revival, led by William Seymour in Los Angeles in 1906, further fueled the classical Pentecostal movement. And even in those early revivals, it's interesting to note that there were Indigenous leaders emerging within the holiness movement. Certainly within the United States, there were Indigenous people and Indigenous seekers that were joining the Azusa Street Revival and its derivatives in Oregon and Washington. Classical Pentecostalism, rooted in evangelical Protestant theology, emphasizes a doctrine known as baptism in the Holy Spirit as a distinct experiential event that is evidenced by speaking in tongues. And this empowerment is seen as instrumental for bold evangelism in anticipation of what Pentecostals term Christ's imminent return. The Canadian Pentecostal movement drew inspiration from the East End Mission and its revival in Toronto in 1906. Ellen Hebden's Pentecostal experience in 1908 attracted numerous followers, and Toronto became known as a, quote, Canadian Jerusalem for Pentecostal pilgrims. The Hebdens played a pivotal role in establishing the first Pentecostal mission to Indigenous peoples in Canada on 6 nations of the Grand River in Ontario around this time. Toronto hosted the world's first Pentecostal Workers' Convention in 1908, and many of Canada's early Pentecostal evangelists originated from the East End Mission. The Hebdens resisted denominational organization, as did many of their contemporaries in Canada. However, Pentecostalism's eventual denominational structures were influenced by the American Pentecostal movement. In 1914, the Assemblies of God, or the AGUSA, was formed, and Canadian connections were established. The Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, the PAOC, formed in 1919 and adopted many of the constitutional documents of the Assemblies of God, USA. The PAOC grew throughout the 20th century, becoming Canada's largest Pentecostal organization and largest evangelical denomination. It is distributed evenly across the country, with a focus, with the exception of Newfoundland and Labrador, which has its own classical Pentecostal denomination. But it's had a focus on missions as its core element. And the PAOC inherited and continued many missionary methods from its predecessors, presenting Christianity to Indigenous peoples in Canada, although the message had been heard from earlier missionaries already. Today, globally, Pentecostalism is considered to be among the fastest growing religious phenomena in history, with some estimating that approximately 35,000 new Pentecostals embrace the movement daily. That's globally. In 2011, a Pew Forum study revealed that there were around 279 million classical Pentecostals globally, constituting 4% of the world's population and 12.8% of the Christian population. Sub-Saharan Africa boasts the largest percentage of Pentecostals at 44%, followed by the Americas at 37%, and Asia and the Pacific at 16%. The movement is currently experiencing its most substantial growth in the majority world, with 740 recognized Pentecostal denominations and a significant number of independent churches. Pentecostalism has a diverse and expansive presence across the planet. But back to Indigenous Pentecostalism in Canada. With the formation of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, before the 1940s, what missionary effort the PAOC extended toward Indigenous peoples held no specific or significant organization. PAOC work among Indigenous populations in the Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario district has the largest continuous history, the longest continuous history, pardon me, although early efforts were neither formal nor coordinated. Canada's first Pentecostal congregation was in Winnipeg, by the 1930s named Calvary Temple, led by Canadian Pentecostal pioneer Watson Argue. Calvary commenced outreach to the surrounding Indigenous populations as early as 1907, over a decade before the PAOC's formal organization. Now, it should be noted that not only did the church reach out to these populations, but significantly, many Indigenous pilgrims also traveled, for instance, by dog sled and train from northerly territories to reach Calvary Temple. The early Canadian Pentecostal pioneer, statesman, and Winnipeg pastor A.H. Argue recorded of at least one such episode. The Winnipeg-based pastor A.G. Ward, who would go on to become missionary secretary of the PAOC, would follow groups back to Fisher River Cree Nation, Nehinaw, and Manitoba to participate in ongoing revival ceremonies held there. And while preaching through an interpreter there, Ward began speaking in tongues. Apparently, Ward's outburst was in Indigenous language as his interpreter replied, "Why, you are now speaking to us in our own language." Concurrent events took place whereby messengers of Pentecostalism, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, carried the movement throughout northern Manitoba communities. There were Indigenous Pentecostal evangelists such as Jim Mackay from Fisher River Cree Nation, who spread the message among territories there as well. Within Manitoba, the PAOC recorded 20 Indigenous congregations by the late 1950s, operating independently and without fiscal support from PAOC offices. Moving from Manitoba into Saskatchewan, the movement likewise gathered momentum there in Saskatchewan, as well as throughout the other provinces, moving into northwestern Ontario, and as well as throughout the West Coast. In British Columbia, the activity of Indigenous adherents predated that of Euro-Canadian Pentecostal evangelists and missionaries. In 1909, a First Nations Pentecostal man recounted that he had been crossing from the United States through the Salish Sea during a violent storm, and the traveler prayed for deliverance and docked safely in Victoria, perhaps marking the earliest arrival of an Indigenous Pentecostal in BC. Later that evening, he offered a prayer of thanksgiving and, quote, saw a tongue of fire descend on his canoe. Similarly, 60 representatives of First Nations communities in northern British Columbia traveled south by boat to Vancouver in 1923 to experience the ministry of healing evangelist and PAOC affiliate Charles S. Price. And it would be another 2 decades before Euro-Canadian Pentecostal missionaries undertook working in these regions. When at first they began to do so, their efforts tended to be quite independent, with the limited mission work occurring in highly localized or regional manners. And so it's helpful to kind of talk about some of those activities that were taking place beginning in the 1940s. British Columbian Pentecostals used what they called gospel boats. These were converted trawlers that ferried evangelists to First Nations territories in northwestern and coastal British Columbia. This fervor was ultimately carried on by Indigenous Pentecostals among their respective communities. By the 1950s, coastal evangelism had contributed to the establishment of 12 Indigenous Pentecostal congregations in British Columbia, totaling 300 members. Across the country, evangelism began among Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. In 1940, the PAOC enacted the Home Mission and Extension Department, aimed at reaching what they termed the unevangelized in our country, and especially the, quote, non-English speaking people. In 1958, the department became further formalized by means of a PAOC General Conference decision establishing the Department of Home Missions and Bible Colleges. In the late 1950s, PAOC historian Gloria Kolbeck lauded missionaries' efforts in the face of seemingly overwhelming economic, ecological, and infrastructural obstacles. She employed characteristically Pentecostal and Lucan terminology to explain, quote, "In spite of these hindrances, many have carried the gospel into Canada's Northland. Some have gone to Judea, that is Northern Ontario and Quebec. Others have gone to Samaria, that is the lake country of Northern Manitoba. Still others had ventured into the uttermost part of the earth as a part of the subarctic mission of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada." The subarctic mission was interesting as it centered on the H.H. Williams Memorial Hospital in Hay River. And starting as a post-war nursing station, the hospital became fully accredited in the 1950s. It was the first and only hospital the PAOC operated within Canada, and the only Pentecostal hospital in North America. And the mission was operated by Ken Gates. Ken Gates, who demonstrated he was a Euro-Canadian missionary, but he demonstrated cognizance of Indigenous traditions and frequently ministered to the Decho-Dene communities that allegedly had no prior knowledge of Christianity. Through the years, Ken Gates associated closely with the neighboring Catalodici First Nation chief, John Lamalise, who is Decho-Dene. And Lamalise became a devoted Pentecostal adherent, translating Gates's sermons as the duo visited, quote, different Indian camps on board that long journey down the Mackenzie River to the Arctic Circle. Both Ken and his wife, Sarah Gates, studied Dene vocabulary as they evangelized Dene settlements scattered along the banks of the Mackenzie River aboard their boats christened the Messenger and Messenger II. And while the lion's share of the missionary effort from the Alberta district concentrated on the Northwest Territories, periodically Ken Gates ventured into Alberta to work among Dene First Nations there with the assistance of local Dene translators. Moving over to Saskatchewan, during the 1960s, the Saskatchewan district named Sam Biro its director of Native evangelism. And from that decade through the 1980s, the Saskatchewan district's Native ministries and the Parkside Bible School sought to direct Indigenous candidates into positions of ministry leadership. By the 1980s, Saskatchewan was among the first of the few PAOC districts to have a full-time director of its Native ministries. Saskatoon's Native New Life Assembly Church named Pat Linkletter its resident evangelist. And in 1980, Roger Ratt, who is Nihithaw, was the first Indigenous student to graduate from Central Pentecostal Bible College in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, before establishing a church in his hometown of Larange. Roger Ratt recalled of the experience, "I believe God has allowed me and enabled me to take this course so that I can teach our Indian people the deeper truths of the Bible. I believe Indian people are tired of running after every preacher and strange teaching that comes our way. God's word is the only sure and stable foundation for our personal lives and churches." Within the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, the Northland Mission provides a helpful case study, and my book spends a lot of time talking about the Northland Mission as it relates to the spread of Pentecostalism among Indigenous peoples. It's a helpful case study because it was one of the most prominent, best funded, and most popularly supported PAOC domestic missions. Further, the Northland Mission's leadership's struggle to implement the PAOC's missiological ideal of the Indigenous principle provides a purposeful focus for my book. Of all of the PAOC's missions to Indigenous peoples, my book gives the greatest attention to the Northland Mission for these reasons. Founded in 1943, the Northland Mission was based primarily within the regions adjacent to James Bay and Hudson Bay in Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and to a lesser extent, the Northwest Territories. Throughout the first 33 years following its establishment, the Northland Mission existed as the brainchild of its missionary pilot founder, John Spilinar, who initially itinerated from the Timmins, Ontario area. And these decades saw the mission evolve from a generic Eurocentric evangelistic organization into an aviation-based mission targeting an Indigenous audience. By the 1950s, aviation allowed the Northland Mission to enjoy newfound opportunities among Indigenous people in North Central Canada, and the mission practiced extensive evangelism among the Nehiyahuak, Anishinaabe, and Ojibwe Anishinaabe. At a time when an absence of roads limited Spilinar's conventional efforts at northward itineration, aviation allowed the PAOC to realize what the Assemblies of God referred to as, quote, that the heavens have become a highway. By the 1960s, there were approximately 15 Indigenous PAOC congregations in Ontario, predominantly under Northland Mission management. And Spilinar wrote these autobiographies or these memoirs that kind of detail all of his adventures and misadventures. In these memoirs, some of them are 200 pages long. He spends quite a volume of his attention speaking more about his aircraft than about the work that he was doing within Indigenous communities, which is interesting because it kind of gives some notion as to where the focus was. But Spilinar was known for his itineration and kind of at times following wherever he felt inclined to go. It was not uncommon for Spilinar's aircraft to stray off course to the far north, where he periodically worked among Inuit communities. In the late 1970s, Spilinar's successor, Dale Cummins, established a central mission station in Pickle Lake, Ontario, where it remained until the early 1990s. And at that time, the Northland Mission's third director, Ian Winter, moved the mission to Sioux Lookout, Ontario. An important aspect of the PAOC's attempt to generate Indigenous leadership was the Northland Mission Bible College, which trained candidates for ministry. The rationale for founding the college was explained thus. The Pentecostal Assemblies wrote this, quote, challenged by the cry of Native Christians for their own Bible training center, they developed the practical school setting. Here students come from all parts of Canada to learn the Word of God and develop their own Christian character and ministry. This distinctive Pentecostal Bible school is committed to meeting the needs of Christian Native people, close quote. According to another report, the PAOC's aim was to establish, quote, a Bible college to educate and train Native students in the North. These Native students will then become the Native pastors and leaders of the mission in the future, close quote. Nowhere is the attempt at the missiological ideal known as the Indigenous principle more prominent and obvious than in the creation of this Bible college, as it is through the college that the PAOC sought to train Indigenous leadership to continue the mission's work. Periodically, the Northland Mission Bible College experienced some success, reaching peak enrollment in the 1980s and enticing prospective students with the offer of ministerial credentialing. But this process for graduates was complicated in the extreme, and eventually it became a disincentive to would-be students. As the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada's expectations of the Bible College grew, its focus shifted away from Indigenous people's needs. And in the college's twilight years, its leadership was interested in generating enrollment primarily to secure the school's survival. Notwithstanding this, geographic and property transition and institutional and management turnover rendered enrollment nearly nil by the early 1990s, leading to the college's closure. We see, of course, that the Pentecostal message went beyond provincial borders, and my book talks more about its extension into Quebec and northern Quebec, as well as into eastern Canada. Pentecostalism won adherents in part because other denominations were perceived to have shifted their focus away from prioritizing an autonomous Indigenous clergy, appearing reluctant to facilitate such channels. And by contrast, the PAOC appeared to enhance Indigenous people's influence. Pentecostalism succeeded in attracting a substantial number of adherents, to be sure, and the result of this is that the Reserve's ecclesial landscape today, along the domain of the Anglican, Catholic, and United churches, is often marked by the prominent display of a Pentecostal church. The PAOC gained significant ground, particularly in North Central Canada. Two more factors that appear to be in Pentecostalism's favor are, first of all, its ease of accessibility. And secondly, and my book goes into this to some length as well, the perception that Pentecostalism holds relevance to an indigenous traditional spiritual cosmology, owing to its predisposition to the use of certain expressions such as indigenous drums, regalia, music, dance, spirit names, oral liturgy, narrative theology, and dreams and visions. I know that's a large generalization. These factors, among others, appeared to render Pentecostalism more attractive to indigenous spiritual seekers than were other denominations. Periodically, both indigenous and non-indigenous Pentecostals wrestled with how indigenous traditional and cultural observances could be integrated into Pentecostal worship through a process termed contextualization. In many instances, Euro-Canadian Pentecostal missionaries strongly opposed any such cultural expressions. Notwithstanding the growth of Indigenous Pentecostalism, this growth has ebbed in recent years. And while some of the Pentecostal assemblies of Canada's geographic districts have remained numerically healthy in terms of the Indigenous churches, in several other PAOC districts, there has been an observable numeric decline. Indigenous Pentecostalism remains a substantial religious force, but that does not mean that Indigenous Pentecostals always subscribe to the PAOC's brand of Pentecostalism. Although once the denomination of choice for Indigenous Pentecostals, the PAOC is at present one of several Pentecostal organizations or organizational options for Indigenous participants. Just to give you some concept of the growth and development of Indigenous adherents, amid or within the Pentecostal assemblies of Canada. In the early 1970s, PAOC missionary secretary Roy Upton reported the denomination as having reached a peak of, quote, 130 congregations dedicated to reaching Canada's 300,000 Indians, close quote. The figure remained above 100 into the early 2000s. At the time of writing my book, however, the number has dropped to fewer than 80. So it had its peak of 130, but now it's fewer than 80. And the reason for the national decline is not entirely clear. There are, of course, the ongoing realities of denominational and hierarchical rigidity. Another contributing factor may include an underlying fluidity of the cited figures, a shortage of leaders trained in the local context following the closure of most of the PAOC's training institutions tailored to Indigenous ministerial candidates. There's one remaining, Aboriginal Bible Academy in Deseronto, Ontario, but many of them have closed. And there's also been the factor of association with non-PAOC evangelical or Pentecostal denominations and networks led by Indigenous people. I mentioned the process of contextualization, and that was a significant one throughout my research as well, in both the archival research as well as in conversations and consultation held through interviews. For their part, Indigenous Pentecostals maintain various positions on the subject of contextualization, and for a variety of different reasons. So one of the things that I emphasize throughout the book is I by no means attempt or assume to speak on behalf of Indigenous Pentecostals. And this is an ongoing conversation among Indigenous Pentecostals. But what my book tries to do is to, through interview, to elevate that conversation into the text. One such interview I conducted with Levi Sampson Beardy, who is Anishinaabe from Bearskin Lake, Ontario, and who currently serves as lead pastor of Aboriginal Believers Church in Toronto. And Levi reflected on his embrace of contextualization by stating this: everything is redeemable. A drum cannot make decisions. A Christian can take that same drum and use it for the glory of God, close quote. And the title of the book itself draws inspiration from something that Levi shared with me when he reflected on these words. When I first became a Christian, there was very much a fear that the spirit within the eagle feather would destroy a Christian's walk completely. But I believe that the eagle feather is an emblem. And even in Isaiah 40:31, it talks about that. But they who trust in the Lord will soar on wings as eagles and run and not be weary. And that whole aspect of the eagle being used as representative of strength and courage as God directs them. I think sometimes when we talk about First Nations belief systems, we take it to the extreme, believing that it is destructive, when at many times I believe it's in the same way as Christianity, close quote. Accordingly, Beardy encouraged Pentecostals, quote, not to fear the eagle feather, but rather to redeem it, close quote. Yet, as previously stated, not all Indigenous Pentecostals embrace contextualization wholeheartedly, and the dialogue continues into the present. Partially in response to this conversation, James Kalapa, the National Aboriginal Ministries Coordinator, he is Makah from Nia Bay in Washington State. In 2000, he announced a revised statement of affirmations addressing the use of Indigenous drums, regalia, music, dance, spirit names, oral liturgy, narrative theology, and dreams and visions. And the statement recommended that PAOC Indigenous ministries should find ways to integrate some of them into Pentecostal worship. Essentially, the document reversed decades of resistance, at least Euro-Canadian missionary resistance toward Indigenous traditional, cultural, and spiritual practices, and allowed for discernment in contextualizing some of them into Pentecostal worship. I want to shift gears to apology and reconciliation within the PAOC, as this was a prevalent theme in and throughout the book as well. In late 2010, the PAOC's Mission Canada department began the process of consulting its Aboriginal Ministries Guiding Group. The Aboriginal Ministries Guiding Group is comprised of representatives of Indigenous Pentecostal ministries across Canada within the PAOC. In preparation of the apology for its shortcomings vis-a-vis the Indigenous principle and for its resistance to Indigenous traditional cultural expression within Pentecostalism. This is a powerful event and a remarkable admission, considering that the PAOC heretofore had not perceived itself as limiting Indigenous autonomy. Indigenous representatives at the 2012 General Conference responded, quote, for the purposes of reconciliation and a healthy unified relationship. The Aboriginal Ministries Guiding Group of the PAOC accepts the apology and extends forgiveness, close quote. To be sure, this was an historic moment within the PAOC. General Superintendent David Wells admirably apologized on behalf of the PAOC and its past leaders. Thus, this apology serves as the natural culmination of the PAOC mission's historic trajectories from the Eurocentric organization through to the autonomous movement of the 21st century. And the apology represents the PAOC's clearest acknowledgement of the poor leadership decisions that contributed to the incomplete transfer of ministry and the lack of confidence that it expressed in emerging Indigenous leadership. The PAOC's leadership expressed contrition for so doing and sought reconciliation. Regarding the PAOC's 2012 apology, of course, it's to the credit of the denomination's leadership that they engaged in the process of seeking reconciliation. But what I found was that it was all the more commendable for the Aboriginal Ministries Guiding Group to accept the apology, graciously agreeing to reconciliation. Still, in recent years, academics and PAOC adherents alike have begun to question the rationale for having Indigenous ministers themselves offer an apology, which was part of the statement. It was called a joint apology. So it wasn't simply the Euro-Canadian leadership apologizing, but there was a statement of apology from Indigenous Pentecostals as well. And so there's been some conversation about that, considering it was the PAOC that acknowledged the wrongs committed against Indigenous Pentecostals. Well, I can't overstate the PAOC's willingness to acknowledge its own past wrongs. My book found that some analysis on this point is merited. And the order through which the apology came about is or partially points to the reasons for this process. So while the PAOC General Executive approached the Aboriginal Guiding Group, in a roundabout way, it was a mutually initiated process, as even before that, the Aboriginal Guiding Group had sought an apology for the PAOC, at least in part because of the PAOC's silence on and historical denial of responsibility for residential schooling. And that came through in the apology as well, that the PAOC was apologizing for its silence on the residential schooling legacy. While the PAOC did not operate residential schools, the PAOC's leadership apologized for historic silence on what was happening in the residential schools. Dan Collado, who is a Mohawk from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory in Ontario, is a former NLM minister. Dan is with us today listening in. Dan, so we greet you. He's a member of the, at that time, what was called the Aboriginal Guiding Group and a participant in the 2012 apology ceremony. And Dan likewise attested to Indigenous Pentecostals' desire for the PAOC to acknowledge the residential schooling legacy as having been a factor motivating the apology. Yet Collado continued to explain the Indigenous minister's counter-apology thus, quote, "We weren't interested in simply heaping on guilt for the sake of getting a confession. The PAOC event was really not about the residential schooling history. That might have been the catalyst, but the impetus for us was always reconciliation. That was the driving force. Reconciliation demands both sides to walk the journey. As Indigenous people, we too recognize we have a burden to uphold our end of the reconciliation wampum belt. It's a case of if someone wrongs you, you're not automatically justified to wrong them. The Indigenous leadership wanted to publicly acknowledge that reality. As we reflect on these words, and so grateful to Dan Collado, who interviewed for this book, the Aboriginal Guiding Group's commitment to reconciliation is deeply admirable and deeply commendable. And I think as this book has moved out of history and into the present, the realization is that the requirement must be for the PAOC, and not simply for the Indigenous peoples within the PAOC. It has to be for the PAOC who issued the apology in the first place, likewise to uphold its end of the process. An agreement to reconciliation requires ongoing commitment. Spoken apology can occur frequently and relatively easily, but following through with reconciliation requires continued effort. The PAOC's apology and joint statement on reconciliation occurring in 2012 is still quite recent, and the substance of it has become increasingly relevant considering Canadian current affairs. The tragic events brought to light in May 2021, disclosing the unmarked graves of 215 Indigenous children at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops, British Columbia, provoked many within the PAOC to pause and reflect on the road to reconciliation. Dan Collado, now in his role as PAOC Indigenous Guiding Group Chair, and General Superintendent David Wells responded by co-releasing a joint statement titled "A PAOC Response to the Kamloops Tragedy," in which they stated, "The Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada is profoundly moved and grieved at the recent discovery of the loss of life for 215 children under the residential school system. We have all been forced to revisit sins of the past as though they happened just yesterday," close quote. The statement went on to refer to the PAOC's 2012 apology and recommitted the denomination to what it termed its, quote, "ministry of reconciliation." While the PAOC's response to these tragic disclosures was appropriate and timely, the events themselves precipitated much soul-searching within the PAOC's ranks. This time of reflection exposed a general sense of discontent within the PAOC with the fact that at times it appears little action has been taken toward reconciliation since 2012, and that conversation about the 2012 apology really only resurfaces when injustices endured by Indigenous peoples are raised in the media and might otherwise be forgotten or at least overlooked. And this trend presents some parallels to national level conversations taking place regarding how few of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action have been acted upon, even in light of the recent papal apology. While it's entirely appropriate for the PAOC to refer to the 2012 apology when realities affecting Indigenous communities and individuals become particularly pronounced, these should not be the only times the apology is invoked. Clearly, the work of reconciliation has not yet been accomplished and may not be accomplished within this generation. Still, efforts towards such a goal must not cease. The recovery of the unmarked graves and the associated despair, trauma, and violence those graves represent both border on the unthinkable. Difficult though this chapter in Canadian public life has been, one outcome is the necessary effect of reorienting the popular opinion yet again back to realities affecting Indigenous peoples. This certainly can be said of the PAOC and its churches. In response to these findings, many churches acknowledge these events in a significant way. For the first time, hundreds of churches within the denomination designated days of reconciliation. In 2021, churches canceled Canada Day celebrations in solidarity with many Indigenous people desiring they do so. Many churches went on to commemorate the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on the 30th of September. And perhaps these conciliatory actions are an indication of measurable steps finally being taken on the long road toward reconciliation. Perhaps the PAOC's 2012 apology is in fact alive and well. And perhaps this is evidence at last of non-Indigenous PAOC leadership, clergy, and laity all taking seriously their commitment to remain in right relationship with the Indigenous peoples also represented within those ranks. On an optimistic note, one might hope that as a result of these conversations, that even if the news cycle shifts away from these realities, and if the inclination of some within the PAOC might be to follow suit, that the proponents of reconciliation will not allow the journey along the road to reconciliation cease. As I conclude, just one final thought. The book argues that decisions made by PAOC leaders contributed to the incomplete transfer of certain ministries, and within my book, primarily, I point to the Northland Mission, the incomplete transfer of these ministries to Indigenous control. Among the factors that led to this disappointing outcome was a lack of confidence in the emerging Indigenous leadership, demonstrated in such areas as succession planning for leadership, resource management, and empowering candidates for ministry. Nevertheless, Indigenous ministers persevered and withstood, giving birth to what today is known as First Nations Indigenous ministries within the PAOC. They demonstrated creative and resourceful ways of being part of the larger body, the PAOC, even when they were not always assured of being welcomed for doing so. Ultimately, it was their faithfulness and persistence, regardless of their reception, that ensured their position. By virtue of their theology, these ministers made it clear that being Indigenous did not compromise their being Pentecostal. And by virtue of their culture, they ensured that being Pentecostal did not compromise their being Indigenous. And in so doing, they fought for the Indigenous principle. Far from being victims, these leaders forged their identity and cemented their legacy, Indigenous and Pentecostal. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Oh, wow. That was really, the time flew by. I wasn't even noticing the clock. I was so interested, so engrossed in the talk. Thank you so much, Aaron. Really, really interesting, really fascinating history and current day affairs and bringing it into the current day. That was actually going to be my question, because the book is especially about the history of Pentecostalism amongst Indigenous peoples. But I'm glad you did kind of an update so that I know the kind of current day status. So we've got a few minutes, everyone, for questions. And so, as usual, if you have a question, you can raise your virtual hand. You can post in the chat that you'd like to ask a question. If you'd rather that I read the question, you can post the full question in the chat and I'll read it out. And so, does anyone want to get started off? I've got lots of questions. How about I start with one? And I'll hopefully break the ice. So Aaron, you talk about the Indigenous principle as a kind of historic principle, right? That was there, but maybe not that well put into practice, depending on the era and the context. So is that principle now, is that like all talk of that is gone and we've now moved on to, kind of reconciliation talks and that you were discussing at the end of your talk? Or is that principle still around? Like are those amongst Pentecostal leadership still using it? As it transformed it, or is it like completely obsolete now?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. I'm joined by Dan Collado, who is the Director of Indigenous Ministries within the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, as well as my colleague and friend Harold Gutierrez, who is the Director of Intercultural Indigenous Ministries for the British Columbia district of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. And so they would be able to speak to this far more effectively than I could. I would say that at the denominational level, to answer your question, the sort of that phraseology of the Indigenous principle is no longer used. I'd say the concept persists, and that the notion is that the ideal scenario denominationally is for Indigenous ministries and churches to be Indigenous led. That still is not always the reality. And there are instances where many Indigenous congregations either do not have a pastor, or if they do have a pastor, several of the congregations, I don't know how many exactly, but many of them do have non-Indigenous ministers as their pastor. And so without criticizing any of those individuals, I think the ideal is still there, although the terminology isn't used, Indigenous principle. But to the second part of your question, I think as a movement, we are at this precipice where the priority throughout the PAOC's history has been missionization, that the nature of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, certainly the nature of the relationship between Euro-Canadian leadership of the PAOC Indigenous peoples has been a relationship defined by missionization. And I think we're kind of at this precipice where there's sort of been a pause. You know, we've kind of pressed pause as a movement, and the conversation is slowly, gradually shifting from the defining word being missionization to wanting to step into the requirement for reconciliation, and for reconciliation to be the defining, word or term of the relationship. But of course, that needs to be unpacked quite a bit before that can become anything close to reality.
Oh, super interesting. Harold, Dan, did you guys want to jump in and add to that, or should we've got a few questions in the chat as well. Okay, well, you jump in if you want to add to that. So Andrew has a question in the chat. Andrew, again, you just jump in if you'd like to ask it yourself, but I'll start reading it since the whole question's in the chat. So Andrew asks, as Christians, how do we reach Indigenous people in light of the recent tension between our communities and certain decolonization efforts that consists of removing the influence of Christianity from society? Ooh, big question.
It's a great question, and I think I do need to kind of circle back to my positionality and again emphasize that I am a settler Canadian and by no means can speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples. I think the way I've come to approach this as a minister, because I wear a few hats, you know, as you heard in my bio, I wear a few hats, and so I'm a historian. I'm also a minister, but I would go back to my previous answer and just say that there is merit in pressing pause on the missionization emphasis. This is my opinion, okay? And I would say that decolonization is actually something that we all can and should pursue. Throughout the history of the PAOC's mission among Indigenous peoples, the PAOC's leadership often used this term indigenization. We need to indigenize Indigenous ministries. The shortfall really came in the reality that a non-Indigenous person cannot indigenize. Only an Indigenous person can indigenize. And so while non-Indigenous people cannot indigenize, what non-Indigenous people can do is decolonize. And so I think there's value and merit in the decolonization process, even as it relates to our opinions and our perspectives. And there was an extent to which this exercise was somewhat introspective for me too, in reshaping my own perception on these priorities. And so I would say that to answer this question as directly as I can, Andrew, as you talk about as Christians reaching Indigenous people, I would honestly refer to the teachings of Jesus Christ, who advocated a gospel of peace and whose witness was demonstrated in action more than in words. And the action of that, in terms of how that's demonstrated, in my view, is to pursue decolonization, to prioritize reconciliation, but also recognize before there can be reconciliation, there must be truth. And we're just in the very, very beginnings of the truth-finding stage. So that would kind of be my approach to that.
Okay, and Danielle Mock has a question in the chat. So to what extent has the PAOC welcomed contextualization? So is it more seen as syncretism? Sorry, I said that in the French way, syncretism between different groups?
Yeah, great question, Daniel. The contextualization and syncretism are both very, very loaded terms. So in the book, I spent a lot more time breaking down what exactly is meant by that. But it's also important to clarify that, as I shared briefly in the presentation, that Indigenous peoples themselves, Indigenous Pentecostals themselves, hold mixed opinions on the contextualization process. And some would wholeheartedly engage it, and others would oppose it and say that anything approaching what they describe as Indigenous culture should be kept out of Christian expression. And so I do my very best. Like this is, I said I wear a couple of hats. This is an instance where I wear the historian's hat, and would just say it's not my position to say what's right. It's a conversation that's being held among Indigenous Pentecostals, and even I mean syncretism as well is there are different, I think there are different terms that better describe. I'm not criticizing, Daniel, your use of syncretism, because that's definitely a word that gets used. But in terms of the processes occurring within Indigenous Pentecostalism, it's not as straightforward as syncretism. There are other factors going on there. But I think that again, to answer your question, has the PAOC welcomed contextualization? There is that statement of affirmations that James Kalapa and the Aboriginal Guiding Group released in 2000 that is intended to assist Indigenous Pentecostals and their congregations in terms of discerning and filtering through which Indigenous cultural and traditional observances can be and should be integrated into Pentecostalism. So that document remains in effect. It's not universally invoked. It's not universally used by Indigenous churches across the movement. So I don't know that there is a fixed PAOC position on contextualization or syncretism.
Okay. Maybe we have time for one more question from the chat. So James McKnight asks, in light of the 2012 apology at the denominational level, how can individual settler congregations work towards reconciliation in their community?
Thanks so much, James. It's a great conversation. It's one to be had. And I think that you answer the question even in asking it in your final line, which was in their community. And so we talk about reconciliation on a national scale as this priority to be pursued, and certainly it is. But I think that we struggle in terms of our putting that into action where it most critically needs to happen, which is on the local level in our own community. And so I would encourage congregations to begin to have conversations with for instance, if there is a First Nations cultural center in your community, to establish a line of communication with that center. In our own church, we've been working toward this. It's a gradual and slow process, but we were among those churches that enacted and has begun to observe the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on our Sundays and make a point of emphasizing that. I think, as always, elevating the Indigenous voice within the local church context is absolutely critical and crucial. And I'm sorry to put Dan on the spot here, but Dan is with us and is having these conversations pretty critically and frequently. And so again, Dan, sorry to put you on the spot, but maybe you would chime in on James's question.
Thanks, Aaron. You've been navigating these questions wonderfully. Just add by reiterating the need for there to be unique expressions at that local level. There isn't, some postage stamp, standard of, well, this is what you do in every situation concerning, how you go about in your reconciliation efforts. It really is about very much relationally driven at that local level. And so the expressions that come through in that local context, and you only know that local context if you're in it, if you're engaging with one another and spending time with one another and being intentional with that give and take and the conversations and the listening and the learning. And so out of that knowledge comes the unique expressions that are needed for that local setting.
All right. Well,
Thanks,
listen.
Dan.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Aaron. I think on that very important note, we can slowly bring this webinar to a close. So again, everyone, the book is out. It's part of the McGill Queen's University Press's Advancing Studies in Religion book collection. And so you can get your own copy. I put the link in the chat closer to the start of the webinar if you like, and the discussion continues in the book. Aaron, it's a full book. It's got lots of information and lots of great discussion and conversation on this topic. And so please go have a look when you get the chance. And as I mentioned, this is part of the Advancing Studies in Religion book series. So if you want, you can go and have a look at the other books in the series as well. They're kind of looking at different approaches to studying religion, especially in the Canadian context, but more broadly as well. And yeah, so with that, we'll have more webinars, I promise, coming up. One for the next book in the series. It'll probably happen in the winter, but they're not fully planned yet, so I don't have any specific details. But look to the CSSR newsletter and our social media feeds for more information for the webinars this term. And again, just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Aaron, for great talk and for the great book. And I wish you all a happy end of fall term, and I'll hopefully see you in the next webinar.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was my great pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye, everyone.